From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, this is Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. I'm Ted Genoways, editor of Switchyard magazine, and your host. Join me and our lineup of literary all-stars as we think through and hash out our world's difficult and fascinating challenges. Welcome, everyone, to the Church Studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's our pleasure to have everyone here. This is our first live taping for an episode of the podcast. We've done a number of episodes here in the past at the wonderful Church Studio, but this is the first time trying this out where we do it with multiple guests and with an audience. So we're very excited to be here in the big room, the former sanctuary of the church. So a wonderful space and a grand opportunity. Tonight is going to be the Switchyard Food Fest, celebrating the release of the food issue of Switchyard magazine. And we have two of the contributors with us. We have Siddhartha Deb and we have Jori Lewis. And I wanted to put the two of you together for reasons that I think will probably be fairly apparent to the two of you, that each of your essays is really about the cultural significance of food and the way that culture influences the way we eat and the way that we eat influences culture and that interplay. And yet, you're writing from different perspectives. But for people who haven't had a chance to read the pieces yet, I wonder if you would each give just a short description of the essays that you contributed to this issue.
Thanks, Ted. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, I wrote about beef and its relationship to Indian food. And I chose it because in some ways it's a personal story. It's a story about how I decided to eat beef when I was 12 years old and how that meant breaking off this with family and culture and religion. But I write a lot about India in both fiction and nonfiction. I write about it away from the received myths about it as just an amazing democracy that has finally embraced the free market. I write a lot about the conflicts. I write about the stories that get pushed aside. I write a lot about violence and insecurity, inequality. And all that is in the piece, but with a kind of, for the first time that I've been trying it, with a kind of memoir aspect to it. It is a lot also about the relationship between me and my father. So that's what the piece is about.
And I would just interject that you write about this expectation of what the reaction might be from your father when you first make this. And I love the description of making the announcement with some formality that you have eaten a beef sandwich and understanding all that that will perhaps mean. And the reaction isn't exactly what you expected.
No, I think that's the reason that I look back at him with some fondness and admiration, because beef has become this toxic thing in Indian culture, a way of dividing a kind of very powerful, dominant majority to which I technically belong, the Hindu majority, and demonizing the Muslim minority, the oppressed castes, Christians. So beef has become a marker of a violent authoritarianism in India. But I'm writing, of course, back in the time when it's a little bit more hidden in the culture. And my father was not an observant. My father was a refugee to begin with. I think that's important. He was a refugee. We are growing up in a part of India where, unlike the mainland India, beef is a part of the diet of the people there. But we didn't eat it and we didn't think about it. And I mean, in school, I was hungry. I said to my classmate who came from the Khasi tribe and they ate beef, it's a part of their diet. And I said, can I have a bite of your sandwich? And he said, are you sure, man? You're a Hindu, aren't you? And I hadn't thought about this. And I said, I don't care. And I took a bite. And then I went home. And, you're looking back at the past. Ideas like teenage and rebellion, these are all new concepts to me. They didn't exist. Nobody called me a teenager when I was 12 or 13. You were on the verge of becoming an adult, a man. I come from a peasant family. 12, 13, you go to work in the fields. You go to work in the factories. Anyway, but I suppose I was undergoing some kind of teenage rebellion. So, I told my father, I said, with some formality. I said, from today, I am no longer a Hindu. And I think I had already knew that I was not very attached to this identity, this religious identity. But yeah, I was expecting, I suppose, from the movies, some kind of violent sort of reaction, patriarchal, authoritarian reaction that I will disown you and I'm going to throw you out of the house. That's a very common scene in Indian cinema and popular novels. And my father was reading the newspaper and he just said, oh, why not? And he kept reading the newspaper, but he didn't even look up. And I said, well, I ate beef at school today and it's supposed to be this, you do this, that's it, you're out of the fold. And I thought he was going to throw me out of the house or disown me or beat me up. I mean, this was not uncommon at all. And my father said, oh, that's fine. And he just went on reading the newspaper. And I was so disappointed. I suppose I was relieved and now I'm proud. But at the moment, I was also disappointed that this act of rebellion had sort of no impact at all. But, it became this long journey and became a big part of later on of who I am as a writer, who I am in the things I write about. And at a certain point in India, and the piece talks about that, beef, it was not just my story. It was in some sense the story about India. And I was also exploding this popular notion, which is very popular in the West, that India is just majority of vegetarians and they're all yogis. This is a complete lie. The majority of Indians are non-vegetarian, actually. This is to do with caste and this has to do with region and particular kinds of identity. So, it gets us back into the question of food and the complexity of food and the diversity of food and the many different kinds of foods and the many different kinds of people. And these are things I am really interested in. So it was fun for me to try and explore them.
The piece is wonderful. And Jori, if you would tell us about your piece first, we were talking last night, trying to remember how you arrived at this. We have different memory of this, which I think is amusing. But this is your opportunity to give your version of why you wrote the essay and to tell us a little bit about its background.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ted. I was thinking about this last night, too. I think we arrived at it by thinking about food taboos and thinking about the relationship that maybe watermelon has in this cultural history of the United States. That dovetailed in a way with the thoughts about peanuts in my book, Slaves for Peanuts, that I talk about in the U.S. as well. So anyway, I would say it's a kind of ethnobotanical exploration of the watermelon and the watermelon's origins, but also an exploration of its cultural history in the United States and what that means personally. Yeah.
Well, and I was going to say that you do talk about your own experience of it, your own family's experience, which leads into some interesting conversations about memory and about, again, the place of food within culture, but also in cultural memory.
So I think when we discussed it, I mentioned this anecdote about my father saying at some point that he wouldn't eat watermelon for many years around white people. But when I went back to my father, he denied it. He denied ever saying it. But I was like, I'm sure. So this is the memory problem. But then, of course, it was common for Black people then, and maybe even still today, to be wary of the watermelon because of the constellation of stereotypes and images associated with the watermelon that are so ugly and hurtful. So I think I was thinking about that. I had recently been in Southern Africa and Mozambique, where I had met this particular biologist who was telling me how much he loved the watermelon in Europe, but that the watermelons he was eating in Southern Africa were not very good. And we were thinking about why that would be, since he thought that the origin of the watermelon was there because of some sort of maybe old science he was aware of and wasn't sort of aware of the more recent conversation about the origin of the watermelon. So I think I was thinking about all of those things, and we discussed it and decided to marry those things together, I think. Both the ethnobotanical aspect, the scientific aspect, and this more cultural exploration.
One of the moments I really love in the essay is this discussion of looking for the right watermelon, how you identify it, and also what that means, what the right watermelon is. For you, what are you looking for?
Yeah, I've always been a terrible watermelon picker, I have to say. So, I mean, really just bad. And like everyone I know, like my husband, he will only buy watermelons from one place where there's someone he knows who picks the watermelon for him. Like, we're just bad at it. So invariably we get one home and it's terrible. But yeah, I think I was thinking, well, what did my mother used to do? Because my mother is like a champion watermelon picker. She's very good at it. We would like drive up to stands full of watermelons, and my dad would bring one to her so she could inspect it to know, because she's the one who really could tell. So there's the color, there's the field spot you want to look for, you got to tap it. And I still don't really know what we're looking for when we tap it. I just know that tapping must be done. And you listen, I don't know, there's like a sound. I couldn't tell you. Basically, the field spot is maybe the thing that I look for. But again, I'm very bad at it. I'm super bad.
Well, the connection that I see between your pieces, as I said, is this cultural place of food. But then this notion that in one instance, eating food can be an act of defiance. It can be a kind of political statement. And at the same time, it's possible for there to be a cultural stigma attached, as there's with the watermelon. And then a particular food staple that falls out of the diet because of those associations. I wonder if you can each talk about what you see as the significance of that, what that tells us about food, but also about just the way that we make culture around food. Either one of you can field that question.
Let me think. So give me the question again. I'm sorry.
I'm just curious about how we make culture around food, how food becomes, I think in many ways, maybe to rephrase, that when we talk about culture making, we very frequently talk about literature, we talk about music, we talk about the visual arts, whereas food is typically thought of something that is a kind of quotidian daily need that is attended to, but is a secondary expression. The whole idea of this issue was to show just how central food is to the way that we think of ourselves and think of the communities that we're making and the way that we're positioning ourselves relative to other communities.
Yeah, so definitely the watermelon. I think when I first started thinking about this, I'm of an age where I didn't really grow up with watermelon stereotypes necessarily. I think that my parents did. That would have been really omnipresent for them. And I think even people younger than me, Black Americans, may not even be aware of them at all. Maybe just a little bit, just around the edges. But I think when I went back to understand, and I think it's always really important to cast historically to understand how these things emerge, there's this super rich story of how Black Americans had used watermelon to support their own economies, to gain freedom while being enslaved, and then eventually after abolition to support themselves economically. And how during Reconstruction, those very same tools, the watermelon and to some extent the peanut, although less so over time, became subverted by the essentially white supremacist ideology that was pervasive in the society for the next 100 years, right? Not that it's gone now, too, but that was so powerful in its image making and its iconography just generally that it shamed people from eating, at least publicly, this fruit that has so much benefit just generally. And then just looking at this comparatively, because I spend most of my time in Senegal, and thinking about like the origin of the fruit and how the fruit just over time has almost, in most places that it grows, it's been this benediction. It's a fruit of so much generosity. You share it. Of course, you have to share it. It's massive. You couldn't eat a whole, I guess some people could eat a whole watermelon by themselves. But that it had always this halo around it, just generally as a food, and became almost a little bit of a poison. And thinking about how we can reclaim that as well. There's a lot sort of going on in the piece, I think, the way I'm thinking about it.
And fascinating, too, that you say that it becomes paradoxically a symbol of laziness and of thievery, this kind of idea that this thing that had been thought of as a symbol of fertility and fecundity, and as you say, something large enough to share and for there to be kind of communal enjoyment of that gets unfairly portrayed as this example of, in particular, I was struck by this idea of it being a symbol of laziness. I mean, when in fact it's so, historically, clearly an indication of the opposite.
Yeah, that's true. It's curious. These things aren't logical, right? Like, you know, how stereotypes emerge in these types of contexts. But it was, it's very clearly in like the post-Reconstruction America, one way to discredit Black people from citizenship, essentially, by saying like all the things they do, they don't earn, like they don't merit, that
Right.
they're just lazy, this type of way of thinking. So, I mean, I think it's even clearly a attempt to discredit them and to say that they're not ready to be citizens.
And again, it's fascinating to me that this can operate in exactly the opposite way as well. The way that you've written about the not just beef as a kind of symbol of whatever, I guess, lack of cleanliness or lack of sort of religious virtue or so on, but you say, I mean, that the beef eater in India is often portrayed as someone who's like not wholly Indian, not wholly human, in the same way that there's this stigma that's attached that is about citizenship on some level, right? Or access to the dominant culture.
Yeah, and it's a question of belonging, right?
Right.
And it's a question of, I mean, even beyond citizenship, I think it's a question of belonging. I mean, food is, to go back to what you started us with, I mean, food is very complex. But I think one of the things is sometimes today's world, it is seen as either entirely a matter of consumption. Right. You know, the restaurants, this is the great new restaurant, this is what you can go and eat. Or it's seen as entirely functional. This is what your body needs to have. It needs to do this. It's seen as these two things. But food is obviously extremely complex because it connects the individual body, it connects the family, it connects communities, and then land and other modes of being, right? So it's all these things. So it's an extremely complex kind of place and difficult in a way to untangle as a writer. But in India, I mean, one of the things is that food is often a mode of separation rather than coming together. So within Hinduism, it is a way of separating yourself from the Muslim, from the Christian, from the oppressed caste. But within that, there are, again, further layers of separation. So there's different ways of being vegetarian. So, you know, at the very top is this ultimate pure vegetarian. And this is ritual purity. It is really about exclusion.
Right.
And I always reacted very strongly to that at a certain visceral level. And I suppose that's why eating the beef sandwich was an act of defiance. Like, this is my friend. This is my classmate. He is sitting next to me. It looks good, it smells good, and it actually tastes very good. Why should I not eat it? And then I do explore later on in the piece that this is a construct, this whole idea, because actually the people from whom, quote-unquote, Hinduism descends, the Vedic people, they were great beef eaters. It is all there in the text. But in India, you can get killed for saying this, right? So these complex constructs. But the other side of food is that on the one hand, there was this, which I grew up with, this way of women always serving men, the women not eating with the men, upper caste not eating with others. I found this deeply frustrating, and the rebellion is important because it's also one of the great places to actually eat. And that is a huge part of my life, was a huge part of my life, and is a huge part of my life. Some of the best food I have eaten is in India, and it's not at a restaurant. It could be in somebody's house. It's the dissolving of the barriers. And eating, it can also be a collective communal act, and that is also the other part of the culture. So again, to go back into talking about my father's a refugee. He grew up in a village, which I have never seen. It's in another country. It's in Bangladesh. But I think this is a scene in my first novel, which is based off an actual conversation with my father. But in the novel, the young boy says to his father, he finds his father like quite strange because his father talks about money. He says, I would get 20 rupees as my salary. And to the boy, like, you know, you can buy like 5 cups of tea with 20 rupees in this modern day. I mean, what did you do with 20 rupees? He said, oh, it was a lot of money. You could buy a whole goat. So then the boy says, but what would anyone do with a whole goat? And then my father said, but we ate it. And he says, who's the we? He says, the village. So if you had a goat, you bought a goat, and you ate it collectively, and it was a feast day for the village. The food can be a mode of incredible separation, but food can also be a way of coming together. And it's these tensions, these completely opposed. On the one hand, it can be about excluding, saying you don't belong. And that's what I talk about in India, the enforced vegetarianism that is the case. And I react to that in a visceral way. So even though my doctor says I shouldn't eat enough, it's quite so much meat anymore, I feel like I'm going to have a steak, I'm going to have a cheeseburger. And it is really a way of rebelling still against these ideas of purity, which to me are completely abominable. So of course, one of the questions of being fully human is actually to embrace. I mean, for me, the only reason not to eat something is actually your body cannot accept it. Your body rejects it. You have an allergy. But otherwise, I see no reason not to eat anything. So again, when I'm a reporter in India, for instance, more than food, one of the great problems is water. So water is something that you have to actually be careful of. And now I have been living here for a long time. My immune system is not as strong as it used to be. But I am sorry to say, I have done this as a reporter. I have been in a village and I'm like, I probably shouldn't drink that water because my body is probably going to not react well. I could have really terrible food poisoning. But I cannot bring myself to do it because I'm aware of these layers of caste identity, purity. I drink the water, even though rationally it may not be the right thing to do. But this person is offering me water. It is an act of welcoming you into their house. And at that point, the history of exclusion, the history of separation, the history of this obsession with purity demands that I am actually going to drink the water. And I do. Well, obviously, I'm fine. I'm here. I'm sitting. I'm alive. You do get sick, yes, but you recover. So it can be a way of exclusion. It can be a way of coming together. And, I take great pleasure in actually eating beef. And there's this whole idea that, again, and I'm sorry, even Gandhi contributed to this with his obsession with vegetarianism, this idea that, meat eating makes people, it's these obsessions of the Hindu right that makes you hypersexual, hyper-aggressive. But some of the most aggressive people in the world are Hindu vegetarians. Maybe they should eat a little beef and maybe it'll help them calm down.
Well, Hitler was also a vegetarian, right? Isn't that what they say?
Oh, yes. Yeah. He does come out. Absolutely.
Well, and as you say, too, that when you start talking about degrees of purity, then you start getting into categories. And one of the things that you write about is this sort of strange expansion of the category of what constitutes beef. So the things that are not really beef start to fall under that heading. Water buffalo and camel and other things that just objectively are not beef, but then they become part of that narrative in some way.
Yeah, because it's a kind of policing. And the thing with policing is that when you can police one category, policing is kind of totalitarian in its desire, that you want to police a little more. And then when you have that, you want to police a little bit more. You just go on expanding. And that's what you're seeing in India. So for instance, very simply put, like in India, these things are always hidden under layers. They are often not visible to Westerners, partly because the West is complicit in the whole rise of the Hindu right. I'm very, very clear about that in all my writing. But when you book a hotel in UP, which is like this great Hindu right state where I went to report, the hotel is not going to tell you that it's a vegetarian hotel. It doesn't say that. The whole website is perfectly modern. It's like, there is a kitchen, there is a thing. And then you go there and you find out that there is actually no alcohol. I'm sorry, I also like my beef. I also like my drinking. I am a man who loves the things of the senses.
Yes, I think that's fair.
But you then check into this horrible hotel in the middle of nowhere where they're trying to build this Hindu right utopia with dollars from Indians in the United States. But you go there and then you find out that, you can't actually, there's no bar because alcohol is not good. It's like unclean. And then you find out that there is no restaurant because I suppose different kinds of people might sit and eat together. How terrible a thing that is. So, you just order into your room. And then you find out that there is actually no meat at all. It is just vegetarian food. By the way, vegetarian food can be very good. I'm really fond of it. But I don't like the enforced nature of it. And that is what is happening. So you see it in India, let's name names. Yeah, I mean, and the piece does it.
Sure.
Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of Britain, his mother-in-law, Sudha Murthy, who is the wife of Nandan Nilekani. She's a great self-help author. You can see her books everywhere in the bookstores. She talks about her vegetarianism and how she carries her own spoon and fork with her when she goes abroad. This is completely absurd. It has nothing. This is completely about ritual purity. I think people have the right to be vegetarian or vegan or just drink water or eat beef. I mean, these are to some degree individual choices. But you see this constantly enforced in rentals, for instance, in certain very conservative parts of India. They will tell you that you cannot cook meat, you cannot cook fish, you cannot do anything. And then it becomes you can't cook eggs. And then I also bring it back to the larger question. 40% of children under the age of 5 in India suffer from malnutrition. Women's health, neonatal health is terrible for a country which has all these billionaires, of whom Rishi Sunak's father-in-law is one of many. We are really talking about questions to do, and to me it's complicated because, it's not just the fault of the Hindu right. It is also the legacy of Western colonialism. Mm. India is also a place this is again forgotten by the Hindu right itself. We are also people who have suffered incredible famines. I mean, when I go to London or in New York, I can't sit at a pub that is named after Winston Churchill. 3 to 4 million Bengalis died in the famine of 1943 in Bengal because they moved the rice out of India into Britain to support the war effort. When the British came into India again in Bengal in the 18th century, 30% of the population died of the famine. It was a population of 30 million people, 10 million people died. So food is really, really a complex issue.
Right.
So in some sense, these obsessions with ritual purities and exclusion, it's moving away from the real debates about people's health, about public health, and the environment and climate change, which I'm also very, very interested in.
Can I ask, why does Rishi Sunak's mother-in-law carry her own spoon?
Because she's worried that if she's eating somewhere else, the spoon might have touched some non-vegetarian item before. And because this is about ritual purity, it doesn't matter how many rinse cycles it might have gone through the dishwasher, it is always forever contaminated.
Got it. Right.
Jori, I wanted to pick up on this notion of kind of enforcement and policing. So much of your work is, again, as we were discussing, is really about agriculture and about thinking about these kinds of bigger issues of the environment. And I can't help wondering if some of the stigmatizing of the watermelon was about policing a source of fruit that is accessible to a Black community and something that could be used to sustain that community and to try to essentially to control it in some way by attaching a certain shame to it.
Mm. I think certainly there's a link with Black people's economic freedom.
Right.
But even though there are the stereotypes, obviously people were still eating watermelon. They just weren't doing it it's about who sees you doing it. It's not about.
Interesting. Yeah.
I guess there may be in some extreme cases people who avoid it altogether. But I think in the piece I talk about Martin Luther King saying he avoided eating watermelon when he was at seminary. But I think I was doing a little bit more research about him. And at his wedding, he had watermelon, obviously. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's about who sees you. What's your identification in this society? And it was based on this kind of widespread, these images that he wanted to Martin Luther King and everyone, right? Pick your civil rights hero. It could be Malcolm X, it could be Martin Luther King, it could be John Lewis or whatever. And everyone would probably have a avoiding the watermelon story or being maybe even taunted occasionally by watermelon. I think I was reading a book when I was writing this piece about stereotypes generally. And if I remember it correctly, the author talks about Joe Louis after some big event. A reporter saying, Joe, eat this watermelon, eat this watermelon. And Joe was like, no, I'm not going to eat the watermelon. He just refused to do it. But because that racism was so upfront, it encouraged a whole generation to step back from what they do publicly. There's a dissonance between their own private private desires, I guess, and what they could do publicly. But I think that there's another sociologist I think I interviewed in the piece who would say, probably, I imagine, I think she did say that there is a larger impact on people's nutrition just generally in terms of stigmatized foods, not just watermelon, but now we have this hierarchy of things we should and should not eat in America, right? Like we shouldn't eat processed foods. Of course, processed foods aren't the best for you, but like in places where you don't have a lot of other options, is it better to eat your processed food or nothing? And thinking about those decisions and how our stance towards them is informed by this kind of legacy of racism is important to consider.
Absolutely. Before we turn to taking some questions from the audience, I wonder if we can take even one step back and remove, and especially in terms of the issue and Food Fest, and I wonder what you each think about the place of food writing and the role of food writing. What sort of things you see? It seems that we're in a kind of golden age of food writing, that the last 15, 20 years have really seen a moment where this has become an area that writers address seriously and feel that it can be seen as a serious topic. I wonder what you see for your own work and maybe some of the people who have shaped your thinking and where you'd like to see things go. I mean, anything at all.
Neither one of us are
it's great. I wish that everyone could see the look that passes, but as the two of you decide who's going to be forced to answer that first.
I have to admit, I have kept away from reading food writing because certainly as an Indian or a South Asian, my sense of it in the United States is that it's something that's written about by a very elite category of South Asians, Indians in particular, who don't really talk about caste, who don't really talk about religion, who don't really talk about class. I've always found these very popular cookbooks that you see floating around in New York all the time. And it's always like my grandmother's mango pickle recipe and my family garden. And I always think, what garden is this? And you do know that most people don't even have like a bed to sleep on. I mean, who are you people? I'm sorry. But these are the people who are hugely popular. So I've always stayed away from this. I think because of my own inclinations as a writer, both in fiction and nonfiction, I've always felt that hunger is a much more worthy subject. Agriculture, I've written about farmers, I've written about industrial farming in India, fertilizers, pesticides. So I've always seen food writing as the territory of privileged people. But having said that, I mean, as I said to you in your question earlier, I have begun to see that it's actually complex and it's possible to bring in other things, which is what I try to do with this piece, to bring in some of those complex questions. So obviously, because food is so complex, you can have tremendous writing about it. Yeah, and I suppose I want to say that at a personal level, I mean, for me, food is also a lot about love, because I like to cook, for instance, and not just like to eat, but I like to cook. And for me, that is a way of actually showing my love for another person. And yeah, so I think food is so complex. And I want to ask you, like, what books should I read? What food writing should I read? What is all this great writing that I have missed out of for the last 15 years? I think I want to sit down and read them, actually.
Well, that's an interesting reversal. I will say, having my own work having fit under this broad umbrella of food writing as well, that much like you, I'm much more interested in labor issues and how that reaches very quickly into class and immigration issues. And to me, food has always been kind of foot in the door. It's a way that you can connect to these issues that may seem remote to people otherwise, that it may be difficult for someone to feel connected to an immigrant community in Southwest Kansas. But when you say, well, they're working at a meatpacking plant that is where your hamburgers come from, it does connect to people. And as you said, it connects to them in a very visceral way, because it's not just something that they have encountered, but it's something that in the most intimate way, this is something that they put into their bodies and that becomes part of them. And to challenge people to think about that process as something that involves other people is, to me, that has been some of the movement of recent years. And I think of that, I guess maybe in my own mind, I think of that as beginning with something like Fast Food Nation, where there's an attempt to very literally say that the cheeseburger that you're eating comes from very specific places. But then some of the things that have come in the wake of that, whether that's, I mean, I would be a big advocate for Barry Estabrook's book, Tomatoland, that was all about the Immokalee Coalition of Workers and that sort of thing. And again, this notion that the interconnectedness of things, the notion that Wendy's decides to differentiate itself from McDonald's by adding a tomato to its burger, and what that does to a whole industry like tomatoes, and what that means for people who work in tomato fields. So I would agree with you that when we're just talking about food, when we're just talking about something that tries to separate itself from culture, I lose interest very quickly. But when it's drawing those connections, I think then whole worlds open up.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely not a food writer as such, right? My orientation is thinking about how the crop, it doesn't actually have to be a food crop, is influencing the culture, how the culture is also influencing it, political economy of that crop. I think because my orientation is always a little bit more historical, I think it's super fascinating to cast back in history and think about why rice or something was traded widely, how it maybe allowed sedentariness in society or whatever, you know what I mean? To think about how we're influenced by those foods and how our orientation toward that food then spreads out, how that relationship with capitalism, with all the shifts generally in our sort of political, social, environmental histories writ large, I think is foods and all of that, obviously. But I wouldn't want to just write about the taste of something, even though, of course, I have.
But that's the interesting thing, right, is that, of course, our tastes drive these things. I mean, I think that one can write like a very compelling, and people have, compelling history of chocolate as sort of a way of looking at colonialism and so on. It would probably be a mistake to talk about all of that without acknowledging that one of the reasons that that is such a powerful driver is because chocolate is delicious. That's a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. I mean, chocolate needed sugar and then these, and also all of those things. Yeah. I think there are a lot of stories we can sort of find when we sort of dig a little bit deeper into how people, as Siddhartha said, I mean, food is so central to how we make meaning about ourselves and our communities and how we share it. All of our rituals, even Americans have rituals, are involving food and thinking about how to connect that to something, to a larger analysis, I think is definitely what I want to read when I say to myself, I'm going to pick up a piece of food journalism, I guess, or some writing about food.
So I want to leave time for all of you to be able to ask questions. There's a microphone set up. Don't be afraid. Look at this. We have a brave first volunteer who happens to be Theodore Ross of the Food and Environment Reporting Network. Go right ahead.
So one of the things that I think is interesting about the connections between your two stories is that they're talking about the weaponization of food, but in very different ways. So in Siddhartha's story, he's part of a dominant group within India that is weaponizing, not him personally, but is weaponizing a kind of food against oppressed and excluded people. Whereas Jori, you're talking about a group that is being oppressed by food, a particular kind of food. And I'm just curious if you two could talk about those themes interacting with each other and within the pages of Switchyard.
Well, I haven't gotten a chance to read the Siddhartha story, and I don't think he's gotten a chance to read mine. The question I had when I was listening to you, though, I was just thinking about, of course, in India, it's very difficult to write what you've written now. I mean, so that if you were to write this in India, would you be in any sort of material danger, like physical danger, do you think?
I think I'm safe in the sense that because I live in New York, I have access to Western publications, I teach at a university, I think it would be a lot of trouble for them. And maybe that's why I do have a lawsuit going on against my last nonfiction book, which has been going on for 15 years and may go on for another 15, I'm told. There's always a lot of anger and hate. But there are people in India who are doing very good work. They are writing very well. There are a lot of very brave writers, often from the marginalized, oppressed communities themselves. And that is one of the things. There are a lot of people who are journalists and writers who are first generation. And so am I. But obviously I have degrees of privilege, nevertheless, of language, caste, masculinity. But there are people who are very, very underprivileged, but first generation, and who are writing, who are exploring these things. Obviously, the mainstream media is terrible in every way. The dominant discourse is terrible in every way, but it's not dead. I mean, when I go there, on the one hand, I feel horrible about just the media and the culture. But I also feel strangely hopeful when I talk to especially younger people. So there is actually a lot of good writing and people are brave. And yeah, I have great editors here, like people who, for this piece, I think Taylor Ross encouraged me to go in a personal direction, which I've never done. I mean, I write fiction and I write very reported narrative nonfiction. I've always avoided the personal in a nonfiction mode. But this time I was pushed to do it, encouraged to do it, and I thought it was a rich place for me. So I think I would like to explore it further. Yeah.
That's good.
Other questions? Oh, all right. I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Jen.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Fahey with Farm Aid, which makes me a proponent of regenerative agriculture and a proud eater of beef. So I read your piece with great interest and connection because for me, in my role as a proponent of that agriculture, I feel strongly that eating beef is important and being an advocate and telling people why, particularly climate purists. So I think more of a comment than a question, but the universality of these ideas of food being weaponized. Because I do go out to eat with vegans who will proudly have their fake meat, and I tell them about the soybeans and the processing and why I choose to eat beef that's grown in a way that is good for our planet and actually can mitigate climate change. So just thank you. Even as a white American, the universality, without the religious taboos, I feel it and it connects really strongly.
But you do talk about having a kind of double consciousness, the phrase that you use, because it is true that it is possible to raise beef in a way that is responsible, but that's not necessarily the way that most beef is raised. So what that means.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, you have to, now I'm going to argue, I do write from a double consciousness and complexity, because you do have to also take into account. You can't just say that beef is great for the planet or beef is great for India because, I mean, I've been said all these reasons why I eat beef and, this is... Right. But like I said, when Western colonialism, primarily the British, but not just the British, when they came into India, and when I say India, it's not just the nation, it's the entire subcontinent. So we're talking about Pakistan, we're talking about Bangladesh. Right. They turned one of the, it wasn't paradise, but they definitely turned a place that was self-sufficient into a place where tens of millions died of famine. Not only that, they also pushed the idea of very Western racism in the 19th century and based on the pseudo-scientific ideas. Beef was very central to it, which I write about. The idea that the English were superior to people of Anglo stock, which includes the Americans, were superior because they were tall, they were strong, they were beef-eating people, as opposed to everybody else who could be oppressed. Now, that is a history we do have to also engage with. When I had a roommate at Columbia University, he was from West Virginia, and he said his only awareness of India was what he had heard from missionaries, Western American missionaries in India. And he said, oh, those are the guys that won't eat a burger because they think it's their cousin. I do have a problem with that too. Right. That is also a kind of stereotyping. So I occupy this complex place, and I think food is very complex. It's very simple to say there's one right or one wrong. I have a very similar reaction to vegans. I mean, when I eat, I feel like a barbarian in New York when I'm like eating beef. But, I do because I carry all these other histories. But what I'm saying is that the truth is really complex. And you're right. I mean, veganism often has degrees of whiteness and class attached to it. I live in Harlem. I go to Crown Fried Chicken every now and then. And most of my colleagues will not. Most of the people I work with will not. But it's a very interesting place, again, in terms of what is happening with class and race and ethnicity, migration. It's important to see these places. We can't just blank them out by saying, oh, these people have bad eating habits. You can get very expensive, very high-end food in a very fancy restaurant in Harlem. But you can also, it's very hard to buy fresh vegetables, although people are trying again. What I'm saying is that I think the beef piece for me was really food is complex. And we cannot, I think maybe be, at least for me, be in a static place about it, because I'm also very aware of the planet and climate and migration. And my understanding of it is changing constantly. And I mean, I feel some sympathy when people say, oh my God, these Westerners have looked down upon us. And they did. We grew up with this. It's like, you people are weak because you don't eat meat. And you people are weak because you don't have guns. And it goes to, you people are weak because you don't have nuclear weapons. And that is what the Hindu right did. Yeah, they excluded beef, but they said, okay, we are going to have massive arsenals and we are going to buy weapons from the United States and you will respect us. And they do. And that is a terrible way to be as well. So, food is so complex in that sense.
Indeed, yes. It's a pleasure to have both of you here. I'm really looking forward to continuing these conversations tonight when we're all together for Food Fest here in Tulsa. This is also an opportunity to encourage anyone who is listening and has enjoyed this conversation to dive into these pieces. They're going to be made available on the Switchyard website, which is switchyardmag.com. They will also be on the website of the Food and Environment Reporting Network, affectionately known as FERN, and that is thefern.org. So there are many places to find it. If you would like a beautiful printed version of this, you can also subscribe to Switchyard Magazine. For now, thank you both for joining us here at the beautiful church studio in Tulsa. Thank you all for being here in the audience with us and for your questions. We will talk to you again next time when we have more episodes of the Switchyard podcast.
Thank you so much, Ted. Thank you, Jori. It's been a pleasure to be on this with you.
Thank you so much as well.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening to Switchyard. I'm your host, Ted Genoways. If you liked this episode and you want to support our podcast, please share it with your friends, post about it on social media, and leave a rating and review. Switchyard is a production of the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. Thanks to our partners at FERN, the Food and Environment Reporting Network, for their support of this episode and Switchyard Magazine's special food issue. You can order a copy of the issue on our website at switchyardmag.com. We made this episode with executive producer Marianne Andre and Charles Lipper and Cassa Lee at Volubility Podcasting. Thanks as always to TU President Brad Carson.